Hello. I'm Allie Michael Cannon, and I'm here to talk to you today about my transgender journey, my story of becoming a man. Because I wasn't always the man you see standing here before you, because I was assigned the gender identity female at birth. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I'm 53 years old today. I grew up in Los Angeles, California, in the San Fernando Valley. And when I was growing up in my elementary and middle school and high school, people never talked about lesbian and gay people, and they certainly never talked about transgender people. But I did have somewhat of a different gender identity as a kid. So I did have a tomboy childhood, and it was safe to have a little bit more of a masculine identity as a kid growing up. So I grew up, and I liked to climb trees, and I liked to play sports, and I was very lucky to have a brother who also supported me in being who I was. In elementary school, I had two friends who also identified as tomboys who were girls, but neither of them grew up to be men. And they are both women today, I know that, from Facebook. And so what was different about my gender journey? Well, for one, I remember a profound story that happened to me in elementary school when my mother took me to the boys department to buy wide wale corduroy pants. And it was an amazing experience for me because those pants felt like a reflection of my gender. And they allowed me to express myself in addition to my tomboy identity. And it was like I had a reflection of myself by being given that permission. So in elementary school, I felt comfortable in my gender. And I got to climb trees, as I said, and build secret hideouts with my friends. And then when I got to middle school, things became a lot more difficult. The pressure to conform and fit in and perform gender in expectations the way girls would be according to the feminine expression of the time was a lot of pressure for me, and I couldn't conform to that. I didn't have the right clothes. It was really hard for me to fit in. And at my middle school, which for me started in 7th grade, I experienced a lot of ostracization and bullying. In my middle school, girls would gather in the quad at our middle school and they would form circles. And if they didn't like you, they would push you out and they wouldn't allow you to talk to them. And that's what happened to me. Girls that were my friends in elementary school stopped talking to me and they wouldn't let me join their conversations. And so I ended up with only one friend in middle school who was also kept out of those same circles. And so it was kind of a lonely and isolating time for me, and I think that was a lot had to do with not fitting into expectations of how girls were supposed to be at that time. So then I went to high school where things got a little bit better. I had more friends, but there was still a lot of pressure to fit in and conform to gender norms. And so in high school, I did things like I was part of the prom fashion show, and I wore a big blue poofy dress, and it felt extremely awkward, and I was really uncomfortable, basically being forced to kind of fit in. And then when I was in high school, right before my senior year actually, I fell in love with a woman for the first time. But it was a very kind of hidden, and I was basically in the closet about that. And then in about midway through my senior year, I came out to one friend. I told her that I was in love with this girl that I met that summer, and she said, "Yeah, I kind of knew that," which was sort of a relief for me. But that was the only time I really uttered that, and I really kind of stayed in the closet after that. And then I went to college. I attended college here at UC Berkeley, which I consider my first coming out. And there in college at UC Berkeley, I joined a sorority, which is basically a Greek organization. It's a large group of women. I had been part of a Girl Scout troop in high school, which was also a big group of women, so I knew I liked being around big groups of women. And so being a part of that organization ended up being very difficult in my sophomore year when I met my first girlfriend, so I had my first relationship with a woman. And there at UC Berkeley in 1982, I was put on trial for being gay. I basically was charged with behavior unbecoming a member of the sorority that causes embarrassment to the house or chapter members. And 100 of my peers, all women in the sorority, along with some adult women who were alumni of the organization, all voted on me and decided that I was to be punished for being gay. I had to hide my identity. It was basically like the don't ask, don't tell policy, if some of you know about that. That used to be part of the US military policy. And I was penalized for being gay. And over time, the persecution became even more intense, and I was a victim of institutionalized homophobia. Eventually, I left the sorority as the persecution continued. My girlfriend and I would walk around campus. People would point at us and say derogatory comments to us. Eventually, I dropped out of college because of that persecution. And after being out of college for a year, I went back to school to UC Santa Cruz, where my brother was also a student, my younger brother. And there I became a women's studies major. And I had a whole other level of acceptance and coming out into lesbian feminist community. I was part of a community that dealt with all forms of oppression in my college experience, from racism to homophobia to sexism and anti-Semitism. But no one at my school ever talked about gender identity. I never heard of anyone who was born female transitioning to male. And eventually, in my lesbian identity formation, I adopted a butch identity, or a masculine lesbian identity. And that's how I identified for over 13 years. Until I met my wife, Jessica, who helped me come out as the man I am today. She's bisexual, so she embraces all sexualities, and she's always been attracted to masculine identified people. And so what started to happen to me in my 30s is that my gender identity started to shift. And so, for example, I would go into a grocery store and people would call me sir, which happened to me as a lesbian too. And when it happened to me as a lesbian, I was like, all right, this person has never really seen a masculine woman before, and they're kind of mistaking my gender, and it really didn't bother me. But as my gender started to evolve, when someone would call me ma'am, it would make me feel like I wanted to hide in my pocket. Versus if they called me sir, I felt like I was being reflected. And so then a kind of cool thing happened. In 1999, Jessica and I traveled to Israel. We're both Jewish, and at that time, I needed to get a passport. So I applied for a passport, and I submitted my passport application. I checked the female box on my application. I submitted my birth certificate, which at the time said I was female, born female, and I submitted a headshot of myself. And I had a pretty short haircut at the time, kind of a military crew cut, and I sent my application off for my passport, and 6 weeks later, my passport came back with an M on it. So someone in the federal government had decided that I was a man. And this was basically like a mystical experience for me. It was like the universe was trying to tell me something, that I was on a journey to becoming male. So I was starting to question my gender identity, and here I was traveling to Israel with a passport saying that I was a man. So we went to Israel for 3 weeks, and the whole time I was there, I was perceived as male many of the places that we went. As an example of that, in Israel, there are a lot of religious sites that you can visit. And at those sites, they have security checkpoints. And if you're a man, they give you a yarmulke, the little like beanie that Orthodox Jewish men wear on their heads. And if you're a woman, they give you like a wraparound skirt to cover your legs to show modesty, because women have to show that they're modest, kind of similar to Muslim women as well. And so everywhere we went, I never got given the skirt garment. Jessica always got given the wraparound skirt. It was hot in the summer. She was often wearing shorts, and I only got given the yarmulke. And that would have been true regardless of your race or ethnicity. They would perceive you, decide whether you were male or female passing through those gates. So that was very intense for me. And in addition to that, I went to what's called the Wailing Wall or Kotel, and I took our lesbian friend's 3-year-old son up with me to the wall, and that wall is also divided into a men's section and a women's section. And that was a very spiritual experience for me. I was surrounded by all of these men, people from all over the world, and it's a tradition to write a note and put it in the wall. And I wrote a note for transgender people, and this was all part of my early coming out process. And so when I came back, I knew I needed support, so I sought out female to male support groups for people born female, questioning their gender, and for people who had already decided to live as men. And in that group for close to 2 years, I tried to figure out what was my gender. And after 2 years of basically like a second puberty, with a lot of angst-ridden questions going on inside, I decided that I wanted to live as a man. And so in 2001, I started taking hormones, testosterone, to help my body match my gender identity. And I've basically never been happier than being a man and having my gender feel whole inside. I'm now a proud father and a husband. In 2001, Jessica, that's my wife, we were married. In our wedding invitation, we announced to many of our friends who didn't already know that I was transitioning, that I was becoming a man, and I was transgender. And we had a big Jewish wedding and celebrated our love, and also were able to claim my transition in that public way. I never wanted to be a father I never wanted to be a mother as a woman, but as a dad, that has felt so right to me. And there's a couple of things I want to say just about what it is to be transgender and experiences that I've had. So for one, as a man, I have to deal with white male privilege. So as a white person, and having white male privilege, I need to be mindful of that. I also need to be aware of how I take up space as a man, because in our society, men get access to power and privilege in really different kinds of ways. For my transgender brothers of color, they have to worry about being stopped by the police and being followed in stores, which is something that I don't have to worry about. And so I also need to show up as an anti-racist ally for my transgender brothers of color. I also have noticed some interesting things in my transition. It's a little bit harder to cry. And this is something that has been confirmed for me by other transgender men I know who've also taken testosterone. So there's some biological differences between men and women. I also have to be a little more mindful about anger, because being on testosterone, you actually do have an easier access to anger, and that's something I have to be mindful of. As a feminist man, that's important to me to be aware of being quicker to anger and how I take up space. And so my story is not only my story, it's also my family's story. It's my wife's story to tell. She's an elementary school principal, and she has to choose whether or not to come out in her professional life about our family. It's also my son's story to tell. He's in middle school right now, and he has to decide when it's safe to come out to his friends. It's my father's story to tell. My dad, who's in his 80s now, was dating in his 70s, and he would often come out to women that he was dating about his son to see if this person would be accepting of his family. So it's my family's story to tell as well as my own. And I'm very proud to say that my family celebrates me as the man I am in the world today. And I'm hoping that by hearing my story here today, you'll be inspired to show up as an ally for transgender people. Most of you aren't going to question your gender identity, but some of you will, and it's become more common in part because of transgender people like myself and my generation and the generation before me and the generation that's coming up now, where more kids are coming out earlier and earlier as gender variant. And you can be an ally by reflecting the pronouns that we want to be called by reflecting the names that transgender people sometimes choose to change our name. And that's a way that you can show up as an ally. You can decide to make your restrooms safe spaces. So it's actually the law here in California under education code that all schools need to be inclusive and welcoming of gender nonconforming people. And one way that you can do that, like some LGBT youth I know made this gender fabulous bathroom at their school. And these are ways that you can help transgender people feel safe and included, not only in restrooms, but in all places of where we are. This is most recently at the LGBT Pride Parade in San Francisco. I went with my family. My kid made a sign. It says, "My mom's bi, my dad's trans, and I'm proud of my family." And I hope that you will join me in that pride and celebration of transgender people. Now is a time where our community is under attack, in part because of how many people have come out, and it's become there's been more awareness and education around transgender lives. So I hope that you will, as I said, be inspired to show up as allies and stand up for transgender people when we need your support and love. So thank you for hearing my story.